In today's video, we want to show you guys all the steps to ensure that your rust is completely neutralized. Everybody always has the fear that is that rust completely gone, or is it going to come back and haunt you months down the road? We're going to show you from bare metal to get it painted, how to ensure that you are good to go. And stick around. I'm going to tell you guys why I hate using Port 15. We've all seen a car that has a really decent paint job on it. Maybe they took all the steps for panel alignment, bodywork, but you find those onesie-twosie areas that have a little blister or a bubble. And you always ask yourself, how do I ensure that those bubbles do not come back later and haunt me? Today we want to dive deep in understanding how to neutralize rust fully, because there's different levels of rust, and we've done videos, if you haven't already seen it, on acid washing and neutralizing the rust for light surface rust. But what happens if you have a little bit heavier of a rust? I wouldn't say heavy pitting, but maybe you have something that has a really solid amount of surface rust. This roof, because it was on the chassis, we didn't have the ability to accurately neutralize that roof. As you can see today, the car is completely flipped upside down on a rotisserie. So we've already done all of the rust repair, rocker replacement, quarter panels, wheel wells, all that good stuff. But we had a decent amount of surface rust inside the roof of this car. And we didn't want to blast it, because if you were to blast it, you have this X structure in the roof, and anywhere that you are blasting, you are stretching the metal. And because of that X structure, you are going to end up with a warpage, because what you're doing is you are introducing an uneven stretch. You would have not as big of an issue if it was a very large curved panel with a lot of strength. But on a low crown, especially a 64 Malibu roof, this is going to go for like your Lincolns, your Malibus, things that are very flat, that don't have a lot of strength. How do we address those rust issues to make sure that they just don't come back and haunt you? We purposely have been planning to do this roof this way since the beginning, because it didn't make sense on our end to take the car off, put it on the rotisserie in the beginning, because the car did not want to get blasted at that stage. Again, you risk warping the roof with blasting. So what options do we have? You could go at the roof with an orbital sander with 80 grit and sit there and work at the rust, but you're not really fully looking at it, let's call it under a microscope level, and making sure that that rust is completely neutralized. And if you're asking yourself, why didn't we acid wash it like we have shown in previous videos, that's going to require using a hose. You're using a lot more liquid, and it's going to pour down into the pillars of this car. There's kind of a pro and con there. I'm just trying to do it the cleanliest way that I can do it without causing acid in areas that I don't want it. I don't want acid running down into a pillar or behind, because then we have all these areas in pinch welds where things are welded together. And if you have any of that acid that's going to seep through, you're going to have a delamination issue in your paint job in those areas. Where if we can keep it centralized in the area that we have it, we already know that the reason that this roof is surface rusted is because of, in an interior of the roof, you have the pad in your headliner. That pad has moisture. Maybe the car sat outside. Maybe the windows were blown out of it. We don't know what the history of this car was. How far do you go? Because we already know there's going to be some level of surface rust behind all of the structures inside of this roof. Now, maybe you take the time to take all those spot welds out, remove them. You can blast structures all day long because they're a thicker sheet metal. They're not going to have the warpage issue. But if you just have a light surface rust that you just want to address in this particular scenario, not everybody wants to dissect the entire car. We are planning on showing you guys how Rust-Mort, which is a SEM product, is used correctly to eliminate the rust completely. If you have used Rust-Mort in the past, have you actually read the TDS sheet and understand the exact steps? Because I can tell you from experience, We didn't always use it exactly as it should be used. There are some indicators while you use Rust-Mort that tell you if you've used enough or if the rust is completely neutralized. So we're going to walk you through those steps. This roof was on the very light surface rust scale, I would say. It didn't have too excessive of pitting, but it did have a couple areas that did have a little bit of pitting. This is nice because what you're doing is we need to knock down the scale. So if we're talking in terms of like you have a frame that's real scaly and it's chunked up and growing, then that's going to take a lot of more metal work because you're going to have to be cutting that out and removing it. But if we're dealing with, let's say you have a fender, a roof like we have, and you have a few areas of patches that have pitting, but the pitting is not bad enough that you can shove a screwdriver through and it's still savable in this case. Our roof for this car was in really good shape. We already did the body work on the exterior, and we just want to make sure that we are prolonging the interior of this car. So we're going to take a orbital sander with 80 grit and we're going to go over to knock off as much of that, call it scaly texture that the rust has. By doing that, we're eliminating how much of the Rust-Mort we put on because we want to take all the bulk of it off that we can. Now let's talk about real quick, what does paint need? Particularly epoxy, because we want to use an epoxy primer to seal up all of our bare metal. Epoxy primer wants a tooth to hold on to. And if you don't have a tooth, the reason that I bring this up is there's different ways to strip rust. You'll see a lot of guys using a wire wheel. A wire wheel is not scratching the metal surface. In fact, it's actually polishing it. So let's just say you used a wire wheel in this roof and then Rust-Mort and neutralized the Rust-Mort and then painted it. You have no adhesion. So over time, that epoxy primer is just going to start flaking and delaminating. That's the benefit of using the orbital sander with an 80 grit. Sure, you can knock off the excess rust with a wire wheel, but make sure that you go in there with a DA and really scratch the surface heavily. I don't recommend a 36 grit or anything that aggressive. I feel like that's kind of the old way concept because people want that aggressive tooth, but you're also dealing with sheet metal that's maybe it's 40, 50 thousandths of an inch thick. You don't have much there and maybe you have welding. If we're using 80 grit on an orbital, we're removing only the very light surface of that rust. And then we are going to take Rust-Mort with a very cheap acid brush, pour it into a little cup, and put it into the sections that you need to neutralize. What you want to do is you want to apply the Rust-Mort pretty liberally to where you have a very nice wet coat over that entire area that has rust. The longer that you can keep that wet, the longer that Rust-Mort is going to continue to eat at that rust. What it's doing is a phosphoric coating similar to the acid washing that we've done in the past, but this has a really nice advantage because if you have a little bit heavier of rust, it's basically soaking into those pores of the metal and it's actually neutralizing the rust. While you're applying it, if the Rust-Mort starts to dry, it basically stops acting. It's not neutralizing anything anymore at that point. That is the whole reason that you want to either submerge it. If you're doing small parts, you can put this in a cup, a bolt, a small part, and it will overnight completely clean the rust and neutralize that off of that part. For a roof like this, where you have this real flat valley, we're going to apply it as wet as we can without running it into the corners of this car and creating a mess. Remember, we're trying to keep things centralized, so we masked off the perimeter at some point, and then we just kept applying Rust-Mort. After you apply the Rust-Mort, I like to let them sit overnight typically and let that stuff really work. I know you could even probably put this down and put some painter's plastic over it to keep the moisture of the Rust-Mort from drying out, and that's going to keep it neutralizing that rust. After you put this on, you're going to see a couple different scenarios. Either the Rust-Mort is going to turn a white coating, which indicates that you did not apply enough Rust-Mort to the surface. And if it's going to turn black, what you are physically seeing at surface level is that the rust that was there is neutralized. What you have to understand is that you're only neutralizing the rust at the very top. So that rust will turn black and it will start chunking off in those areas. And at that point, whether you're using a gasket scraper, whether you're using a wire brush, or even coming back through with a DA, you need to knock all of that back off. Because it is an acid product, you need to neutralize that for paint. So depending on how heavy your rust is or how pitted it is, you put Rust-Mort on, you let it sit, you let it convert. And if you have, this is exaggerated, if you have rust in layers, right? You neutralize that layer, but if it's not soaking into the bottom layers of that crusty area, you're not getting it all. So DA all that bulk off that's neutralized. Now you're going to get to the next level of rust and you're going to work through it. This may take 3-4 coats back to back to make sure that you get nice, fresh metal. But what is nice about this is on a microscopic level, you are ensuring that all of the particles of rust that have formed on that panel are at least covered and neutralized when you have nice shiny metal. After you get everything completely clean, let's talk about that tooth that the epoxy wants. You either have two forms of adhesion. You have mechanical, which is the scratch that the epoxy is sinking into and adhering to, or you have a chemical adhesion. I want you guys to understand that nowhere in the TDS sheet for this SEM Rust-Mort does it say that you're getting a bond chemically for epoxy to adhere to. It is different than doing the acid washing process that we have described in other videos. But for me, I always have trust issues and I want to make sure that I get the best adhesion that I can get. And that is why I always DA everything really thoroughly to scratch the surface. And whether I'm acid washing to get a chemical adhesion or using a Rust-Mort, I know that at the end of the day for that panel, we have a decent enough scratch that we have everything that we need for that epoxy to stick. But there's one more thing that you need. After you see that the panel is becoming cleaner and cleaner with every time that you apply it and sand it off. Let's say we put it on for the very last time, we have a few little areas that we want to address and we recoat those. After it has converted and you now have a clean panel, you want to take a wet rag. You can hose it off with water depending on, we didn't want to bring in the hose for a roof panel, but we took a really wet rag, a clean rag, and we wiped the acid off of the surface because that acid you need to neutralize. Otherwise, you're going to have blistering under your epoxy because of that acid. As long as you neutralize that surface, you're not going to have that issue. For me, I'm going to neutralize it really good, go back over it with a DA, and just really make sure everything is completely clean for that surface. And at that point, you can come in with whatever standard wax and grease remover that you are going to use, clean that nice clean surface that you have, and then mask it off and apply your epoxy primer to the surface. If you're asking yourself, this seems like a lot of steps when I could just go buy a product like Pour 15. Why would you not just Pour 15 the roof versus take these extra steps? Let's compare some of the things that we have experienced personally for Pour 15 versus Rust-Mort. Rust-Mort is not going to prolong the surface. So if you have a rusty roof and you put Rust-Mort on there, you are not sealing it from moisture. It is only to convert the rust. That is what the epoxy is doing, is sealing out that moisture at that point. Where you have a rust converting paint like Pour 15. I personally am not a fan of Pour 15 because again, we talked about how we're neutralizing those layers of rust, right? And we're ensuring that we're all the way down now to clean metal. But if you're using Pour 15, you are only getting the surface to be neutralized and coated. Now, does that work for your application? Maybe. Maybe you have light surface rust, and maybe it's a tractor that you throw in the yard, then that makes more sense for you. But what you have to understand is that if there is any underlying rust that Pour 15 did not convert, it is going to show. The other side effect of Pour 15 that we've experienced, let's say you're doing a chassis and that chassis has some flex. Over time, pour 15 gets harder and harder and harder. And at some point, it usually cracks. And when it cracks, it's because there is rust below that is not neutralized and it's continuing to grow. So now what you have is something that is coated with a paint product that has a slight crack, and now it's going to have a pocket that gathers water, and you physically cannot see that rust continuing to grow. That is why, to me, if you're going to spend this much time on a restoration and you want to make sure that things don't come back, you need to take the extra steps. Does that mean you're cutting a panel off and removing it and checking? And what does that spectrum look like? We often acid dip a lot of our cars, depending on the project and the budget. And people always ask, what are you putting inside the rockers to seal out from the rust? Sometimes we're pulling the rockers off to spray epoxy primer in there or paint. Sometimes maybe a cavity wax works for you. I am not a fan of cavity wax because anytime the temperatures go up or down, that cavity of that wax inside of that rocker will then get soft and it could seep out. It just is a messy product, or it can be. It's not meant to be used heavily. It's meant to be used on the light side. But how can you ensure that inside of an area that you can barely see? So really the only way to ensure that is to remove the panel and actually seal it up and only have a slight area where you're going to pinch weld it back together. So again, you have to kind of be a realist with your project. We already know, and I think that people see the new cars today and everything is E-coated and submerged in, maybe it's an E-coat or a powder coated frame or whatever it may be, where that product can actually go inside of cavities and seal them up. But what you have to understand is that these old cars in the 30s, 40s, all the way through, they were never sealed up, most of them, inside of those areas. So let's talk about where your car is today. If you're starting your restoration and you have surface rust inside of these areas, that surface rust is probably on the lighter side, hopefully, but not always. So if you acid dip your car, at that point, as long as the acid dipper is telling you that they are neutralizing the rust, because not all acid dipping processes are neutralizing rust, at least at that point, everything inside is neutralized at that point in time. It's up to you to figure out how to get into those areas to seal that up to where you're not going to have excessive rust. But if we're going to do this bit, is it better to just leave it surface rusty or just dip it and get everything clean? We don't have to deal with sand. We don't have to deal with warpage. In my opinion, that is superior. We are going to be looking into doing laser removal with rust and testing that on exterior sheet metal panels, so stay tuned for that. But again, I think this is a very simple and very effective way to eliminate issues on your restoration. I hope this video was very informative for you guys. I hope it helps you on your project. If you guys got something out of it and you have a friend, share it. Please like, subscribe, and we will see you guys on the next video.